Ilara often thought of her life as a perfectly finished etching. Sharp lines, deliberate shading, and no room left for stray marks. At 52, living in the quiet, tree-lined community of Maple Grove, she had achieved a level of contained serenity that she both cherished and secretly resented. Her days ran on a track worn smooth by a decade of habit. Morning coffee brewed at 6:45 a.m. 3 hours in her detached backyard studio working on her precise, large-scale abstract canvases, an afternoon walk through the neighborhood, and evenings spent with classic literature or carefully chosen documentaries. She was an artist, known locally for her bold use of color confined strictly within geometric shapes and irony that mirrored her own life. She had carefully drawn boundaries around her heart and her future, convinced that all the dramatic, unpredictable acts of living belonged to a time that had definitively passed. She valued stability above all, having learned the hard way that instability, like uncontrolled pigment, only resulted in a beautiful but agonizing mess. The chapter of real surprise has closed. She might have admitted to a close friend, if she had allowed herself one that wasn't politely contained within the perimeter of a scheduled event. Her home, a sturdy brick bungalow, reflected this ethos. Everything was intentional. The muted sage walls, the perfectly organized bookshelves, the minimalist garden where every hosta and hydrangea obeyed the strict laws of symmetry. She didn't lack for comfort. She lacked the delicious, terrifying friction of the unknown. The quiet equilibrium of her life had been subtly disturbed 3 years prior by the arrival of Jensen, maybe 55, moved into the craftsman house next door, a house that, unlike Ilara's, embraced the organic chaos of its rambling flower beds and eccentric trim. He was a recently retired architect who had traded blueprints for chisels, spending his days in a large, messy garage workshop, dedicated now to the creation of intricate wooden boxes and small, perfect sculptures. He was a man of quiet steadiness, defined by his hands always slightly stained with sawdust or graphite, and his eyes, which held a deep, observant gaze. He didn't fill space with noise. When he spoke, it was usually a concise comment on the quality of light falling on a fence or a brief, insightful remark on the challenge of translating a three-dimensional idea into a tangible form. For Ilara, Jensen was initially just a variable in her otherwise fixed equation. They would exchange polite waves across the hedge or comment about a particularly aggressive weed at the shared property line. But gradually, a bridge began to form, built not of grand gestures, but of simple, necessary moments. There was the afternoon when Ilara had tried, and failed, to muscle a heavy, awkward canvas frame into the back of her small sedan. Jensen had materialized from his garage, silent and competent, lifting the object with an ease that betrayed his age. "You were negotiating with gravity," he had remarked, his lips twitching slightly. "It's a losing battle." There were the shared thermos moments. Ilara would be out in her garden, pruning with surgical precision, and Jensen would be sweeping sawdust from his driveway. He'd pause, offer a cup of his dark roast, and they'd stand there for 10 minutes, discussing the complex beauty of a specific rose, or the frustrating lack of commitment in the local squirrels. These moments were unscheduled and therefore precious. They allowed Ilara a rare freedom from her own internal clock. She recognized in Jensen a kindred spirit, someone who also lived with intention, but whose intention flowed from a different source. Where she sought containment, he sought mastery and depth. Recognizing that beauty often lay in the imperfection of the grain, she realized she genuinely looked forward to his presence, to the easy silence they could share. But she held a firm line in the sand. This was a valued friendship, a comfortable adjacency. Life at this stage, after all, was about comfort, not dramatic change. She had learned to expect less from destiny, and in doing so, had constructed a safe, quiet fortress around herself. It was a late afternoon in early summer when the conversation shifted from the structural stability of her cedar siding to the possibility of her own life. The sun was low, casting long, geometric shadows across their adjoining driveways. The air thick and sweet with the scent of freshly cut grass. Ilara had been describing the frustration of trying to find the right shade of burnt umber. For her latest piece, Jensen had been sketching something small and circular on a scrap of paper. Listening intently, he paused, put his pencil down on the siding, and turned to her fully. "Ilara," he said, his voice dropping slightly, the kind of tone that demanded attention. "I'm taking a few days next month to visit the Cedar Point Lodge up north. You know, that place on the deep lake near the foothills. I used to go there when I was working on big commissions, just to sketch and clear my head before a deadline." He looked at the vast, green sweep of maple grove around them, then back at her. "Would you consider coming along? Just for a few days." The question hung in the air, heavy and incongruous, like a raw, unplanned color splash on a finished canvas. I laughed instantly. A sharp, almost nervous sound. The sheer absurdity of it, a vacation, an unplanned retreat, with her neighbor, miles away from her fixed, comfortable routine. "Jensen, are you serious?" "Completely," he affirmed, his gaze steady, devoid of mockery or undue pressure. "I think you could use a break from those perfectly square canvases of yours. The light up there is different. It's wilder. I think it might do something good for your umber problem." He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. No pressure at all, but please think about it. That night, Ilara didn't sleep. The inner debate was fierce, the two sides of herself battling for dominance. The logical fortress presented a list of irrefutable reasons. It might be awkward. It will stir gossip. Your routine will be broken. You don't travel. You don't do spontaneous. But the other side, the deep, younger voice she had tried to silence for years, was whispering louder now. It spoke of a longing for an unplanned disruption, for a moment of truth that might break through the dull repetition of her carefully ranged days. She realized she was tired of her own predictable precision. And the critical, defining truth was this: she trusted Jensen. He was a man who moved with a kind of integrity that made her feel safe, even in the face of the unknown dot by 4 a.m. Staring at the perfectly symmetrical shadows cast by her window blinds, she knew her answer. The risk was enormous, but the cost of not going felt heavier. The next morning, when Jensen was loading a new length of timber into his garage, she walked over, holding her second cup of coffee like a shield. "Jensen," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand, about the trip to the lodge. He turned, the timber resting on his shoulder, his expression calm. "I'm in," she said. "I said yes, but I have to warn you, I am utterly terrible at spontaneous fun." Jensen smiled, and it was a rare, genuine expression that transformed his steady face. "Good," he said, dropping the timber with a gentle thud. "I'm an architect, Ilara. We're good at building structures for things that haven't happened yet. Consider the fun engineered." The week leading up to the departure was defined by nervous anticipation. Ilara's preparations were meticulous, a final, obsessive embrace of her routine before she abandoned it. She meticulously cleaned her studio, sealed the canvases, and left detailed, color-coded notes for the neighbor checking her mail. This retreat was not just a vacation. It was an act of deliberate, calculated self-sabotage of her own established order. The morning of the drive arrived, crisp and bright. As Ilara carried her small, orderly suitcase down her driveway, she paused. It felt like walking away from a perfectly constructed diorama of her own life. When she settled into Jensen's older, well-maintained SUV, the thrill of the unknown hit her sharply. Jensen had thought of everything. She saw the heavy thermos of dark roast, the curated playlist of smooth 70s jazz stacked by the console, and a thick, beautifully bound map book resting alongside the GPS. "In case we decide the path less traveled needs better paper coordinates," he said with a wink, adjusting the rearview mirror. The first few hours of the drive were spent traversing the familiar, Flat landscape of the plain Ilara still stiff, speaking in carefully constructed sentences about the merits of the playlist and the rising gas prices. Jensen allowed her routine, answering her practical comments with calm consideration. Then, as the highway began to wind and the first wooded hills appeared, Jensen turned the music down slightly. "I know you're a little nervous, Ilara," he said, not looking at her, keeping his focus on the shifting road. "But I promise you this. There is no deadline here. There is no expectation. We are just two people who have decided to sit still together while the scenery changes. That's it?" His permission the explicit statement that she didn't have to perform was a quiet shock. It was the moment the tension in her shoulders began to unwind. The conversation that followed flowed as smoothly as the coffee in the thermos. They spoke about early creative dreams, his of building houses. That felt like they were grown from the land, hers of painting vast, impossible landscapes before she confined herself to geometry. They spoke about failure, the complex failures they'd learned from, and the shared, slightly absurd feeling that they were both occasionally waiting for the real second act of their lives to begin. Ilara found herself confessing her most protective fear, the loss of her creative spark. "I feel like I'm painting the same painting over and over," she admitted, staring out at the blur of pines. "The lines are perfect, but the risk is gone. And without risk, the work is just decoration." Jensen listened with an unwavering attentiveness. "Risk is where the true color is," he finally said. "But you can't force it. It has to be invited in. Maybe that's what this trip is for, Ilara. An invitation." His attention was a tonic. He made her feel seen in a way that her routine life had forgotten how to do. As they left the final stretch of flat land behind them, the conversation became the landscape shifting, deepening, and full of surprising contours. By the time the air grew sharp and cool, scented with pine and the promise of deep water, Ilara knew the trip was already worth the enormous risk she had taken. The fortress had not been stormed, but rather, one of its heavy gates had simply been unlocked from the inside. When they finally arrived at the Cedar Point Lodge, the last vestiges of daylight were fading. The massive structure, built from dark timber and stone, looked like it had stood watch over the lake for a century. A huge hearth dominated the lobby, already spitting cheerful sparks into the cool evening air. Ilara's room was across the hall from Jensen's, overlooking the deep blue lake. It was simple, sturdy wooden furniture, a thick quilt, and windows that framed the silent water and the gathering peaks. That first evening, as the dinner bell rang, they walked down to the stony shore. The air was sharp, and the sound of the waves lapping the rocks was a steady, rhythmic meditation. The sun dropped behind the peaks, creating deep, theatrical shadows across the water. "You know," Jensen said softly, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, "I didn't actually believe you'd say yes. I truly thought the fortress was impenetrable." Ilara smiled, pulling her shawl tighter. "It nearly was, but I am truly glad I did." They ate dinner in the lodge's small, dimly lit dining room, sharing steaming bowls of rich, wild mushroom stew. The isolation of the place encouraged honesty. Jensen spoke about the shock of stepping away from a 40-year career, the feeling of suddenly having too much space, and the specific kind of loneliness that followed his wife's death years prior. He was not bitter, just honest, describing the process of redesigning his own life from the inside out. Ilara listened, acknowledging the weight of his grief and the quiet resilience it had forged. Then she spoke of her own void, the years she'd spent prioritizing stability over passion, the anxiety that she had let her most vibrant creative ideas with her. "I felt like I was waiting for the real me to reappear," she admitted, "but she was hiding inside the perfect geometry." He reached across the smooth, dark wood of the table and placed his hand briefly over mine. It was a gesture of solidarity, not possession. It simply said, "I understand that kind of waiting." Back in my room, Ilara lay awake. But this time, It was not the hum of anxiety keeping her company, but a strange, thrilling sense of possibility. It felt like a fresh page, waiting not for an etching, but for a bold, surprising wash of color. Ilara woke before the dawn officially broke, not to the shrill discipline of her Maple Grove alarm, but to a vast, hushed luminosity filtering through the thin cotton curtains. The light was silvery and complex, reflecting off the dark surface of the lake outside her window. It was the quality of light that artists craved, one that suggested infinite possibilities in shadow and reflection, a stark contrast to the flat, dependable sunlight that poured into her suburban studio. She lay still for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds, the occasional sharp call of a loon across the water, the low, comforting creak of the ancient lodge timbers settling, and the soft, steady rhythm of her own harder rhythm that felt, for the first time in years, completely separate from the ticking of a schedule. The warmth that had kept her awake was not residual heat from a blanket, but the strange, comforting sense of possibility that had settled over her after dinner. Jensen's words, "I understand," that kind of waiting had dismantled a small, critical piece of her internal fortress. She was no longer just the woman waiting for her life to resume. She was a woman capable of being seen in that act of suspension. She finally rose, moving quietly in the stillness, dressing in soft wool and denim. The small mirror in the room showed her face, unadorned, perhaps a little tired, but framed by a quiet curiosity she hadn't recognized in years. The lodge's main floor smelled delightfully of wood smoke, coffee, and something yeasty, like freshly baked bread. The radio in the corner of the small breakfast room played a station that seemed trapped in a timeless loop of gentle folk music, fitting perfectly with the dark wooden beams and the framed, sepia-toned photos of fishing boats that lined the walls. Jensen was already there. He sat at a corner table near a window, a newspaper folded neatly under his elbow. 2 heavy ceramic mugs sat before him. When he saw Ilara enter, he stood immediately a small, old-fashioned courtesy that felt enormous in its absence from modern life. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and warm, designed not to disturb the quiet. "I wasn't sure how you take it, so I brought options." He gestured to a small, neat row of creamers and sweeteners he had evidently charmed from the kitchen staff. Whole milk, heavy cream, honey, and even a tiny carafe of oat milk. It was a detail the careful anticipation of her needs that touched her deeply. "A brilliant feat of reverse engineering," Ilara said, taking the heavy mug. She chose the cream. "Thank you, Jensen. You spoil my ability to complain about coffee. Complaining is welcome, too," he replied, smiling as he slid back into the booth. "But I prefer to architect comfort where I can." They ate in a comfortable silence at first, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the distant argument of a couple debating which local sightseeing tour was less touristy. Ilara watched the sunlight catch a stray beam of dust around Jensen's shoulder, noticing the fine network of lines around his steady eyes, lines earned, not given. "So, architect of comfort," Ilara finally said, setting down her mug. "What structure are we building today?" Jensen unfolded a local hiking map, smooth and thin from years of handling. "The weather is perfect. I found a walking trail that winds up through a stand of pines, leading to a lookout point near the Devil's Cascade. It's a bit of climb, but the view of the lake is unparalleled." And he added, tapping a spot on the map, "There's a small town a mile or so past the trailhead. They have an excellent, tiny bookstore." The owner mentioned a specific section of journals and sketchbooks. "I thought you might like to see it." Ilara felt a sudden, surprising tightening in her chest. "You remembered I said I used to keep a sketchbook." "I listen." "Ilara," he replied, and it was not a boast, but a simple, profound statement of fact. Chapter 5. The Roar of the Unspoken Trail. Named the Whisper Path, quickly ascended into a thicket of wine-bent pines. Their needles were matted, smooth in one direction by years of prevailing winds, a permanent testament to patience and weather. The air was crisp and carried the damp, clean smell of decaying leaves and pine sap. The deep blue lake appeared and disappeared below them, a mesmerizing flash of color through the dense foliage. Soon, the path became steep, requiring their full attention, and the need for conversation vanished. They walked in rhythm, the crunch of gravel under their worn leather boots, and the occasional call of a distant hawk marking time. It was a companionable, wordless effort. After nearly an hour, they reached a ridge where the trees fell back, revealing the source of the persistent roar they had been hearing. The Devil's Cascade. Water threw itself down a sheer cliff face, white lace dissolving into a massive, frothing pool below. The noise was immense, loud enough that words felt almost futile. Ilara stood near the worn, heavy wooden railing, the wind whipping her hair free from its clip. The spray carried on the air misted her cheeks, cool and vital. She felt the massive, uncontrolled energy of the water, a force of pure, beautiful chaos that defied geometry. Jensen approached her. "May I?" he asked, lifting his hand toward the stray strands of her hair. Ilara nodded. His fingers were large, the pads slightly rough from his woodworking, but his touch was feather-light as he gently twisted her clip closed again, securing the escaping hair. There was nothing rushed or proprietary in the gesture, only a quiet concern for comfort. They sat on a flat rock nearby, which had been baked warm by the morning sun. Below them, the world was all sound and motion. Jensen watched the water for a long time, his silence waiting now, suggesting something more than peaceful contemplation. "When you talked about waiting for the real you to reappear," he finally began, his voice low, forcing Ilara to lean in to hear over the cascade. It resonated. "After Eleanor, my wife, passed, I didn't just lose her. I lost the architecture of my life. Every room, every piece of furniture, every routine was a structure we had built together." He'd rarely spoken of his loss beyond a brief acknowledgement. Ilara remained silent, her gaze steady, offering him the respect of her complete attention. "Grief does strange things," he continued, looking not at Ilara, but into the furious spray of the water. "It's not a single explosion. It's a long, slow erosion. For 2 years, I tried to preserve every single piece of that structure. I kept her office exactly as it was. I used the same coffee mug. I tried to live in the past tense." Ilara thought of her own geometric fortress, the relentless need for control. She recognized the impulse. "I only started to breathe again when I realized I wasn't honoring her by standing still," Jensen said. "I was just suffocating myself. I had to let the house become my house again. I had to build a new structure, not for forgetting, but for continuing. That's why I retired, started the woodworking. It was the only way to prove I could still create something new with my hands. Something that didn't rely on a past foundation." He finally turned to her, his eyes clear but vulnerable. "The space that was left when she died, it was too big, too loud. I learned to make quiet peace with it. But peace is not the same as joy." Ilara reached out, finding the heart-shaped stone's pale twin in her memory. She didn't offer a solution or a platitude. She spoke from her own experience with the messy reality of art. "The most profound moment in painting," she said softly, "is when you finally stop trying to control the pigment. And instead, you listen to what the pigment wants to do. You respect the boundaries of the canvas, but you let the color be free." Jensen absorbed this, nodding slowly. "Exactly. Freedom within the form." He sighed, the breath a release. "Thank you, Ilara." "For what?" "For letting me say it out loud to someone who won't try to turn it into a project. Someone who just listens to the texture of the confession." They sat together for a long while, the roar of the cascade filling the space, a massive, noisy, necessary silence. They had traded burdens, her fear of creative stillness for his acceptance of emotional erosion. When they finally headed back down the trail, the path felt smoother, their rhythm more aligned. Chapter 6. a curator of Moments Be Noon. They had reached the small, secluded town that sat nestled below the ridge. It was a cluster of weather-beaten shingle buildings housing a few quiet cafes and artisan studios. They stopped first for cold cider from a street vendor who wore a knotted, paint-splattered apron and the kind of smile that suggested he rarely left the immediate vicinity. Elara felt the immediate relief of the cold drink and the pleasure of watching the simple flow of mountain life. They separated in a companionable way as they explored the town square, the kind of silent understanding shared by people who trust each other not to vanish. Elara drifted into a small gallery showcasing local wood carving. The scent of polished walnut and cedar was intoxicating. Jensen found her there, standing before a display of exquisite, hand-carved birds. They were simple, stylized representations: a hawk, a raven, a tiny, elegant goldfinch. That one, Jensen said, pointing to the goldfinch. It reminds me of the moment I saw you laugh about the map book in the car. It's small, but it has a specific, bright joy. Before she could protest the sentiment, he had paid the artisan. He handed her the small, smooth piece of wood, a portable reminder, he said. Elara ran her thumb over the curve of its tiny wings. It's beautiful, Jensen. Thank you. She felt the flutter, not the fleeting vanity of receiving a gift, but the deeper recognition of being known through an object. They moved next to the bookstore Jensen had mentioned. It was a cool cave of wooden shelves, filled with the intoxicating scent of aged paper and binding glue. A small brass bell announced their arrival, and a woman with silver braids and reading glasses nodded in welcome. Elara found the travel journal section easily. She sifted through various notebooks that covered diaries, spiral-bound field guides, and one slender, faded blue linen book with a small brass clasp. On the very first page, a delicate script read, "For the record of days you didn't want to forget." She held it, feeling the weight of possibility. This was not a diary for complaints or schedules, but an archive of moments. Jensen appeared at her shoulder. She turned the book so he could see the inscription. "Buy it," he said softly. "It suits you. You've been living in an archive of control. Now it's time to start curating moments." "I haven't written in years," Elara admitted, the old fear of performance creeping in. "What if I don't keep it up? Then it will hold a few very good days," he said, his perspective so simple and profound it was impossible to argue with. "The measure of a life isn't its span, Elara, but the precision of its moments." She bought the book, along with an old, monochrome postcard of the town's pier at dusk. The shopkeeper slid the journal into a paper bag and tucked the postcard inside, without charging for it. "A souvenir," she said, her eyes twinkling. From one recorder of days to another. Chapter 7. The shape of permission in the late afternoon. The clouds gathered over the lake like a serious council of elders. The air changed, growing heavy and expectant. By the time they returned to the lodge and prepared for dinner, the first drops of rain tapped insistently against the windows. They chose a sturdy little restaurant across the road, the kind of place that looked like it had weathered 100 seasons. They ordered tomato basil soup, which arrived in thick white bowls with handles. Halfway through the meal, the power flickered once, twice, and then died entirely. A small, collective cheer rose from the room. Then, candles appeared from every corner as if the room itself had been practicing for this moment. Someone produced a large, ancient battery-powered radio and music from afar off. Clear station drifted in a soft, soulful melody from decades past. The storm pushed against the walls, but the restaurant answered with laughter and the clinking of cutlery. Jensen looked at Elara over the small, dancing candle flame. The light threw his face into dramatic, warm relief. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said, surprised again by the utter truth of it. The storm, the darkness, the chaos, none of it held the anxiety it once would have. "May I sit beside you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space on her side of the booth. Elara moved over. He slid in, not quite touching her, leaving a respectful inch of air, the kind of space that says, "You are free to lean in if you want to, and you are free not to." The profound courtesy of the gesture was not lost on her. When the radio found a melody with a soft drum and a patient rhythm, Jensen smiled. "Do you dance?" "I used to," Ilara said. "Very badly. Then we'll match." They stood. The floor was sticky in places, but the candlelight made the entire scene feel magical, ephemeral. He held out his hand, palm up, and waited. Ilara placed hers in his. The contact was simple and ancient. They swayed slowly. Ilara laughed once when she stepped squarely on his shoe, and the sound felt utterly free, unedited. "Ilara," he said quietly, and she looked up at him, her chin resting near his shoulder. "May I hold you closer?" "You may," she said. She moved into the inch of space he had offered. He drew her in gently, his hands settling loosely at her back. She rested her cheek against the fabric of his shirt. It smelled like clean cotton and a faint trace of cedar. They didn't speak. The music did the talking, translating how the heart wants to stand with another heart without making a single impossible. Promise Dodd when the song ended. They returned to their booth, finding their soup miraculously still warm. The power blinked back to life, and a thin line of applause ran through the room. Later, walking the short, mist-shrouded dash back across the street, they paused in the lodge hallway between their rooms. "Thank you for tonight." "Jensen," Ilara said. "Thank you," he replied, "for saying yes to all of it." He hesitated, his steady eyes searching hers in the soft, humming glow of the wall sconce. "May I hug you good night?" "Yes," Ilara said. The embrace was warm and encompassing, but brief but perfect. Respectful acknowledgement of the connection they had shared. He didn't linger too long or rush away. He simply stepped back, and she felt the grace of that restraint almost as strongly as the embrace itself. Inside her room, Ilara sat at the small wooden desk and opened the blue linen journal. The first page felt like a lake at dawn, undisturbed, waiting for her to decide whether to swim. She dipped her pen and wrote about the storm and the dancing and the wooden bird. She wrote about the profound way Jensen asked every time, and how that deliberate seeking of her consent made her feel powerful and desired simultaneously. "I realized tonight that respect is not a rule. It is an instinct, and consent felt like a conversation that had finally learned its manners." When she finished, she tucked the postcard of the pier behind the paper band at the front. Chapter 8, Sediment and Promiseth World. The next morning was scrubbed clean and bright, the light sharp enough to cut shadows. They rented bicycles with wicker baskets and bells that made a pure, delicate sound. They rode along the deserted path near the lake, nodding at the few early fishermen. At a wide corner where the wind gathered, Jensen suddenly stopped and pointed. Below the railing, a narrow set of stone steps led down to a secluded cove, a small, half-hidden amphitheater of rock and sand where the tide left its secrets. "Let's see what the water brought in," he said. On the beach, the morning's treasures lay in a ribbon along the waterline. Pale driftwood, smooth, dark pebbles, and fragments of sea glass polished by time. Ilara crouched, mesmerized by a piece of green glass, its edges dulled by time and travel. She held it to the light, and it glowed like a small, hell,